is here tonight. He's one hell of a good actor.
Ladies and gentlemen, here he is, Dennis Hopper.
Dennis Hopper, a man of many talent.
I give up.
I've done about 10 or 11 movies.
You want to go for a ride?
You know what I mean? When you get her.
And I'd stopped drinking and taking drugs at the time, which is really weird.
Hopper developed a reputation as kind of a madman.
Natalie fell off a boat. I'm sorry. That's.
Every crack represents a life I've saved.
No.
Director says you don't know you're lying.
That's when I was running naked through the jungle. Boy, if they just had a camera, they could have had a hell of a scene. Finally hired me to do something in Mexico called Jungle Fever, which I never shot one day on. And then like World War III started.
Imagine being a Hollywood icon handed the largest paycheck of your career for a film you barely need to work on. Now imagine blowing that entire opportunity in a single night of drug-fueled mayhem that leaves you naked in a Mexican jungle, convinced you've started World War III. This isn't a fever dream, it's the true story of Dennis Hopper on the ill-fated 1983 production of Jungle Warriors. In this documentary journey, we explore how Hopper's legendary wild streak turned a golden payday into one of Hollywood's most bizarre cautionary tales, all delivered with a dash of humor and hindsight. Dennis Hopper was no ordinary actor. He was Hollywood's original Hellraiser. By the early 1980s, Hopper had already lived a life that most performers wouldn't dare to even portray on screen. He'd risen to fame as a 1960s counterculture icon with Easy Rider, and just as swiftly crashed out of the mainstream after the calamity of The Last Movie in 1971. That self-indulgent passion project earned him critical scorn and a second exile from Hollywood. In true maverick fashion, Hopper didn't calm down. He went rogue, taking his talents and troubles on a global tour.
Dennis Hopper represents the Hollywood ethos that really doesn't exist anymore, that of a true rebel.
Throughout the 1970s, Hopper became a cinematic wanderer. He jetted off to the Australian outback to film Mad Dog Morgan, where he indulged in such prodigious drinking that a local judge declared his blood alcohol level was legally dead. He popped up in Germany to star in Wim Wenders' The American Friend, bringing his unique brand of manic energy to the streets of Berlin. In France, he joined the cast of an arty oddity called Flesh Colour, and in Italy he filmed a spy thriller so obscure it's mostly remembered, if at all, for having Dennis Hopper in it.
And I really appreciate Francis writing.
He likes you because you're still alive. He's got plans for you. No. I'm not going to help you.
When he says, who are you? Why don't you say, who are you? Because I haven't learned my lines yet. I know, you've had him for 5 days.
He even spent the shoot of Francis Ford Coppola's epic Apocalypse Now deep in the Philippine jungle, often as high as a kite. Rumour has it Coppola kept Hopper happy on set by paying him in cocaine. In short, by the dawn of the 1980s, Dennis Hopper had built a reputation not only as a brilliant actor and filmmaker, but as a one-man whirlwind of chaos. He was the kind of star who treated life like performance art, blurring the line between character and self-destruction. Hopper's exploits off-camera were the stuff of Hollywood legend. This was a man who once literally shot at a tree while on LSD because he thought it was a grizzly bear.
I consumed about half a gallon of rum a day, with a fifth of rum on the side just as a backup, and about 28 beers and 3 grams of cocaine. Being such a stupid guy and such a drug addict and alcoholic.
He bragged of drinking 28 beers plus half a gallon of rum every day at the height of his binging, washing it down with cocaine for good measure. He started orgies and whipping parties while filming in Peru, snorted lines of unknown powder that turned out to be a colleague's cremated remains, and generally behaved as if immortality was assured. By 1982, however, the fun was clearly wearing thin. Hopper was pushing middle age, his phone wasn't exactly ringing off the hook with big studio offers, and his body was feeling the toll of years of abuse. Friends whispered that he was a mess. Dennis, of course, swore he was invincible. Little did he know that his wildest adventure and rudest awakening was right around the corner. In early 1983, against all odds, Dennis Hopper found himself staring at the prospect of a major payday.
They finally hired me to do something in Mexico called Jungle Fever, which I never shot one day on, but I was to play the head of the DEA in Mexico.
A West German producer approached him with an offer to join the cast of a low-budget action flick titled Jungle Warriors. On the surface, it was a far cry from the artistic glories of Hopper's past. A schlocky B-movie about fashion models versus a drug lord in a South American jungle. Hardly Easy Rider or Apocalypse Now. But the producers weren't really after high art. They wanted a dash of Hopper's notoriety to spice up their film and its marketing, and they were willing to pay absurdly well for it. In fact, the fee on the table was, as Hopper later noted, more than he'd ever been offered for a role. This was the biggest paycheck of his career, dangled in front of an actor who hadn't seen a big Hollywood salary in years. The gig itself was almost comically easy. Hopper was cast as the head of the DEA, essentially a glorified cameo as a government official, with a grand total of 17 lines of dialogue. That's it. Fly down to Mexico for a brief supporting role, speak a few dozen words on camera, and pocket a small fortune. It must have sounded like the easiest money Dennis would ever make. After years of hustling in the wilderness of independent and foreign cinema, here was a chance to pad his bank account without breaking a sweat. Naturally, Hopper said yes in a heartbeat. He may have been a wild man, but he wasn't stupid, at least not yet. With dollar signs in his eyes, Dennis Hopper packed his bags, likely imagining a quick exotic holiday and a fat check at the end. What could possibly go wrong on a trivial B-movie shoot in Mexico? As it turned out, absolutely everything. Hopper arrived in Mexico in the spring of 1983, ready to collect his loot. The film's production had set up camp in the city of Cuernavaca, a sun-drenched colonial town south of Mexico City. With its lush gardens and grand hacienda-style hotels, Cuernavaca must have looked to Hopper like the perfect playground. He stepped off the plane with the swagger of a man who felt he'd beaten the system, getting a massive payday for minimal work. If Hopper had any intention of behaving himself and playing the consummate professional, that resolution didn't survive his first night. The stage was set for a perfect storm. A hard-partying actor in a land where tequila flows freely and the 1980s drug scene was in full swing. For Dennis Hopper, temptation was everywhere. It only took a few hours and one very bad decision for it all to go horribly wrong. No sooner had Hopper checked into his hotel in Cuernavaca than he dove straight into celebratory mode. According to his own later recollections, he barely dropped off his luggage before sidling up to the hotel bar, or perhaps his room's minibar, stories vary, and helping himself to some local refreshment. In classic Hopper fashion, he didn't start slow. He slammed back 3 shots of tequila in quick succession. A reasonable toast to his good fortune, one might say. Except these particular shots came with a little extra kick. Hopper would later insist that the tequila had been laced with LSD without his knowledge. Whether someone mischievously spiked his drinks or he accidentally dosed himself remains a mystery.
I went on one of my major benders and ended up... So I was hearing friends of mine being tortured in this hotel when I got there, and there was a dungeon down underneath, you know, and they were being tortured, and I was a hologram at this time, and being attacked by poisonous snakes. And then like World War III started, and that's when I had to take my clothes off. Now, in my mind, they wouldn't be able to kill me if I was naked. And walking down the Cuernavaca main highway naked, you know, and being arrested and put in various jails.
Perhaps Dennis simply couldn't believe that plain old alcohol alone was responsible for the technicolor madness that followed. In any case, after shot number 3, our intrepid actor realized something was very, very off. Within minutes, reality began melting at the edges. The hotel walls seemed to breathe. Sounds grew distorted. Dennis Hopper, veteran of many a psychedelic escapade, recognized the signs. He wasn't just drunk, he was tripping hard. For a man who had consumed nearly every substance known to man, this was a trip to end all trips. At first, he might have tried to ride it out in his room, but paranoia soon seized him. In his altered state, Hopper became convinced that unspeakable horrors were unfolding around him. He later recounted that he believed there were people being tortured in the bowels of the hotel, secret dungeons under the floorboards where innocents were screaming for help. Even more bizarrely, he thought these imaginary victims had come to rescue him, and their torment was somehow his fault. In Hopper's mind, a heroic mission to save Dennis Hopper from something had gone awry, and he was to blame for their suffering. This wild, paranoid delusion might sound absurd, but under the influence of LSD, it was terrifyingly real to him. As the hallucinations tightened their grip, Hopper decided he had to escape. From his room, from the hotel, perhaps from his own demons. Fight or flight kicked in, and Dennis chose flight. He burst out of his hotel into the warm Mexican night, desperate, disoriented, and as high as a satellite. The streets of Cuernavaca beckoned with dark, unfamiliar shadows. For any onlooker, the sight of a famous Hollywood actor stumbling out of a nice hotel in obvious distress might have been alarming. But the night was young, and Dennis Hopper's descent into chaos had only just begun. He was about to take the concept of location scouting to a whole new, ridiculous level, straight into the jungle. Once outside, Dennis Hopper ran headlong into the tropical darkness, convinced he was fleeing some great danger, or perhaps racing towards some imagined destiny. The manic logic of LSD was now in full command. To Hopper, the quiet city streets and nearby jungle were a battleground or a grand cosmic stage. Later, he would sum up his mental state with a memorable line: "I thought the Third World War had started." In the theatre of his mind, apocalyptic doom was unfolding and he was at the centre of it. So what did our unwitting action hero do? He headed for the trees, of course. Somewhere on the outskirts of town, Hopper stumbled into the foliage, and his night of hallucinations went from bad to outright surreal. Certain that enemy forces or evil spirits were on his heels, he plunged deeper into the brush. The jungle in the dead of night can be eerie at the best of times. Add a head full of acid and Dennis Hopper's imagination, and it became a personal episode of the Twilight Zone. Every rustle in the leaves was a phantom pursuing him, every distant light a spaceship or a divine sign. In his delirium, Dennis became increasingly unhinged from reality. Ordinary concerns like clothing, for instance, now seemed trivial, especially once the insects arrived, or rather once he imagined they arrived. At some point in the chaos, Hopper felt things crawling on him. He could feel bugs under his skin, slithering snakes in his clothes. In a panic, he began tearing off his garments to rid himself of the imagined creepy crawlies. Shirt, trousers, underwear, all of it was yanked off and cast aside in the darkness. Before long, Dennis Hopper was as naked as the day he was born, thrashing about in the jungle brush. Lesser men might have paused to reconsider their life choices at this juncture, but not Dennis. He simply continued his wild odyssey au naturel. If anything, the lack of clothing seemed to free him to fully embrace the madness. And embrace it, he did. In one infamous moment that Hopper later unabashedly confessed to, he found himself face to face with a tree. A tall, knobbly tree that, for whatever reason, became the focus of his LSD-fueled passions. Perhaps he thought the tree was a person or a mystical entity. Perhaps he just felt an overwhelming surge of primal energy. Whatever the cause, Dennis Hopper decided to engage in an act of intimate self-gratification then and there. Yes, Dennis Hopper masturbated in front of a tree in the middle of the jungle while tripping on LSD. It's a sentence one doesn't expect to hear about an esteemed actor, but by his own admission, it happened. In his twisted perception, this wasn't a disgraceful spectacle. It was a cosmic event. Hopper believed he was experiencing some kind of ecstatic transformation. He later remarked that at the time, he genuinely thought he had become a galaxy. One can only imagine the scene, a naked, mud-smeared Dennis Hopper howling at the stars, engaging in lewd acts with foliage, and proclaiming himself one with the universe. If the models of jungle warriors were looking for a photo op in the jungle that night, they certainly got more than they bargained for. As the night wore on, Hopper's hallucinatory journey grew ever more elaborate. At one moment, he might have been crouching in the undergrowth, hiding from imaginary soldiers. At another, he was gallivanting through a clearing without a stitch of clothing, possibly convinced he could fly. He later described feeling that he was being guided by a spaceship controlling his mind, as if extraterrestrials or some divine force were beaming instructions straight into his brain, leading him through this maze of hallucinations. By now, Dennis was the star of a one-man psychedelic action film directed by LSD and playing exclusively in his head. The supporting cast featured monstrous insects under his skin, phantom commandos, and aliens in the sky. He was lost in his own fantasy, utterly unaware and likely beyond caring that he was also very much lost in a real jungle, completely naked and alone. At long last, after what must have felt like an eternity to Hopper, the first light of dawn crept over the Mexican horizon. For all his cosmic wanderings, Dennis had managed to survive the night, a small miracle in itself. As the morning sun filtered through the trees, the harsh edges of Hopper's trip might have begun to soften, but reality was not done slapping him in the face. Dennis stumbled his way back towards civilization, scratching and bruised from his nocturnal adventures. He emerged onto a road on the outskirts of Cuernavaca, a road now beginning to stir with early morning traffic. To a delirious Hopper, these cars might have been enemy vehicles or perhaps mechanical beasts. In any case, he did not welcome them. In a final act of defiance against sanity and basic road safety, the completely nude actor started hurling rocks at oncoming cars. One imagines bewildered drivers swerving to avoid the stark, naked, wild-eyed American, pelting them with stones at the roadside. If there was ever an award for most original way to quit a movie job, Dennis was making a strong case. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before the authorities arrived. The local police in Cuernavaca must have been thoroughly unprepared for the scene that greeted them. A foreign movie star, utterly naked and raving nonsensically about war, spaceships, and who knows what, throwing rocks at traffic. It's the sort of call that ends up being recounted in the station locker room for years. Several officers carefully approached Hopper, who by this stage was likely exhausted, dehydrated, and still halfway lost in hallucination. They managed to subdue the frantic actor and, perhaps out of a sense of basic decency, produced a robe or blanket to cover him up. But Dennis Hopper was having none of it. Even with handcuffs at the ready, the police found themselves negotiating with a man determined to remain as nature, and a lot of tequila, had made him. Hopper flatly refused to put on a robe. In his disordered mind, he was still in the throes of some life and death cosmic showdown. Clothing was an unnecessary nicety. In fact, as he resisted the officer's attempts to drape something over him, Hopper delivered one of the most darkly comic lines of his career. And this was off camera. He insisted he wanted to die in the nude. Yes, amid all the insanity, Dennis was apparently convinced that his final stand, perhaps against a firing squad of hallucinated enemies, should be conducted without any clothes on. One might say he was committed to going out on his own terms, however absurd those terms were. The police, understandably perplexed, did not grant him his wish to be executed in the buff. Instead, they wrestled the feisty actor into custody. Hopper did not go quietly. Reports later noted that he fought and even begged the officers to kill him, trying to bait them into shooting. The man was practically daring the Mexican police to perform a summary execution on a Hollywood celebrity, all because his LSD-addled brain thought it was a fitting end to this adventure. Thankfully, the cops had more sense than that. Dennis Hopper was instead hauled off, presumably given at least a pair of trousers at some point, and placed under arrest. Thus ended the craziest night of Dennis Hopper's life. In the span of mere hours, he had arrived in a new country, dosed himself, intentionally or not, with a heady cocktail of tequila and LSD, fled phantom demons into the jungle, communed with the cosmos in the most unseemly way imaginable, and gotten himself arrested while stark naked and shouting at traffic. It was, to put it mildly, not the smooth first day of shooting that the producers of Jungle Warriors had hoped for. But the fallout of this escapade was just beginning. Dennis had turned up in Mexico to make a movie. Now the only thing he was about to star in was an international incident and a personal catastrophe. News of Hopper's pre-dawn arrest spread quickly among the film crew and producers. By the time Dennis had a chance to sober up, if indeed he did, in a local jail cell, the team behind Jungle Warriors was already reaching for the panic button. Here was their high-priced Hollywood import, the big name meant to add marquee value to their film. Not on set, delivering his 17 lines, but behind bars after a naked rampage. It didn't take long for the producers to conclude that Dennis Hopper was more trouble than he was worth. In the unforgiving calculus of B-movie filmmaking, even a legend can be shown the door if he threatens to derail the schedule and budget. And derail it, Hopper certainly had. Without shooting a single scene, he had managed to halt production. There would be no dramatic close-ups of Hopper as the DEA chief bravely fighting the drug lord. Instead, the real drama was in a police station and the tabloids. It was the biggest paycheck of Dennis's career, and he wouldn't earn a penny more of it. The producers summarily fired Dennis Hopper on the spot. One imagines the awkward phone call or visit to the jail. "Thank you very much, Mr. Hopper, but your services on this picture are no longer required. Please do not bother coming to set, clothed or otherwise. We'll be proceeding without you." Given the circumstances, Dennis could hardly argue. He had, in industry parlance, blown it. In one night, he went from being the highest paid guy on Jungle Warriors to an unemployed cautionary tale. The irony was rich. This cushy gig was supposed to be easy money, a quick in and out. Instead, it became a literal in and out of jail. Of course, the show must go on. Hopper's role, a small but pivotal part, needed to be filled, and quickly. Enter Marjoe Gortner, an actor of considerably lesser fame, though with his own colourful history as a former child preacher. Gortner was swiftly hired to replace Hopper as the DEA chief. It's hard not to chuckle at the thought. The filmmakers went from Dennis Hopper, counterculture icon, to Marjoe Gortner, a man whose name alone sounds like a downgrade. But Marjoe, at least, could be counted on to show up to work fully clothed and not under the influence of hallucinogens, which at that point was all that mattered. If Hopper ever watched Jungle Warriors later, which seems unlikely, he would have seen Gortner delivering those 17 lines of dialogue that were supposed to be his. In retrospect, swapping Dennis Hopper for a lookalike might have been the production's least ludicrous plot twist. Meanwhile, the freshly sacked Hopper faced another immediate challenge: getting out of Mexico in one piece. The local authorities, having had their fun with the naked Hollywood lunatic, were probably just as keen to see him gone as the film's producers were. The quickest solution was to deport Dennis Hopper back to the United States and let him be Uncle Sam's problem. So, likely within a day of the incident, Hopper was collected from jail, handed his belongings, perhaps along with the remnants of his dignity, and escorted to the airport. He'd arrived as a movie star ready to work. He left as a disgraced headline bundled onto the next flight out of Mexico. But in true Dennis Hopper fashion, the drama still wasn't over. Because even at 30,000 feet in the air with the jungle behind him, Dennis found a way to turn the trip home into yet another outrageous scene. One might think that being fired, arrested, and effectively run out of Mexico would have sobered Dennis Hopper up. But the aftermath of an LSD binge isn't so tidy.
Until some stuntmen found me and finally got me on an airplane. And I walked out on the wing of the airplane as it was taking off in Mexico City, thinking I was being filmed by Francis Ford Coppola and Wim Wenders, who I'd seen on the airplane, which were not on the airplane, hello. But I was in bad shape.
As Hopper boarded a flight bound for Los Angeles, likely connecting through Mexico City, he was still a man on the edge of reality. The drugs in his system had not fully worn off, and his mental state teetered between exhausted clarity and lingering hallucination. He took his seat on the airplane, perhaps believing the worst was behind him. He was wrong. At some point during the flight, Dennis's fractured sense of reality struck again with a vengeance. Somewhere high above the clouds, Hopper became convinced that the plane was on fire. To his eyes, smoke might have been swirling in the cabin. It wasn't. Or flames licking at the windows. Pure imagination. To put it simply, he thought the aircraft was going down in a blaze. An understandable fear if true, but in this case, completely false. The other passengers, no doubt blissfully unaware of the non-existent inferno, were calmly sipping their beverages or dozing. Dennis Hopper, however, launched into full panic mode. In his mind, he had to act to save himself, and perhaps everyone else, from certain doom. And so, in a move as dangerous as it was absurd, Dennis decided to open the emergency exit door mid-flight. Yes, our hero attempted to essentially let himself out of the airplane at altitude. Accounts of this incident vary in their specifics. Some say he actually got up and tried to physically open the door, others that he hallucinated and perhaps fiddled with the handle, and one colourful recounting even has him walking out onto the wing at Mexico City Airport, which suggests the plane might have been on the ground when he tried his stunt. Whatever the precise timing, the essence is clear. Hopper, still gripped by delusion, nearly created an air disaster because he couldn't tell a drug flashback from reality. If this were a scene in a movie, it would be darkly comic. A frenetic Dennis pulling at the exit door while alarmed flight attendants tackle him to the floor. In real life, it was deadly serious. Opening an aircraft door in mid-air is nearly impossible due to cabin pressure, but even attempting it is enough to send everyone into a panic. Fortunately, the flight crew intervened before Hopper could do any real harm. He was restrained, gently, one hopes, and the plane continued safely. Perhaps they diverted to get him off at the earliest opportunity, or maybe he was kept under watch until touching down in Los Angeles. The details may be lost to time, or simply overshadowed by the rest of this saga, but we do know that Dennis survived the journey without adding airplane crash to his list of misadventures. It's a miracle that no charges were pressed for his mid-flight antics. Likely the airline and authorities chalked it up to a medical issue or just wanted to avoid more headlines. When Dennis Hopper finally set foot back on American soil, he was a free man in the legal sense, but he was also a wreck, mentally, physically, and spiritually.
Then I was hospitalized when I got back to the States, and I was 3-4 months.
Clearly what you are is A, survivor, and two, someone once said to me, they can never take your talent away from you.
Being such a stupid guy and such a drug addict and alcoholic, I obviously, it took a little more than a big club to drop me down and make me humble me enough to realize that I could never do those things again.
The biggest paycheck of his career had effectively evaporated, and in its place he carried only the shame of a scandal and the bruises, to both body and ego, from his wild trip. If ever there was a rock-bottom moment for Hollywood's premier rebel, this was it. And to his credit, Dennis seemed to know it. Upon returning to the United States, Dennis Hopper had no choice but to confront the sobering fallout of his Mexican escapade. His friends and loved ones who had witnessed his downward spiral seized this opportunity. They implored Dennis to get help, to check himself into rehabilitation before he quite literally ended up dead. Perhaps to their surprise, Hopper agreed. Maybe it was the terror of that night in the jungle still fresh in his mind, or the realization that he'd just torched a once-in-a-lifetime payday and narrowly avoided death. Maybe he was simply too exhausted to resist any longer. Whatever the case, the 47-year-old actor finally said yes to rehab in 1983, admitting that he needed to get clean and sober for the first time in decades.
How bad was the alcohol and all this stuff?
Oh, the alcohol was awful. I was a terrible alcoholic. I was doing the coke so I could drink more. I started drinking in the morning. I drink all day long.
Checking into a rehabilitation facility, Hopper began the arduous process of detoxifying his body from years of alcohol and drug abuse. It turned out that the horrors of withdrawal would rival even his worst LSD nightmares. Almost as soon as he dried out, Dennis was hit with severe hallucinations again. Not from drugs this time, but from the lack of them. The clinical term is delirium tremens, though Hopper probably just called it hell. He saw things that weren't there, shook uncontrollably, and descended into a paranoid delirium eerily reminiscent of his jungle trip. Only this time he was under medical supervision, and there were actual doctors and nurses to subdue the imaginary snakes and spacemen. To calm his tremors and psychosis, doctors administered heavy medications, likely antipsychotics and sedatives potent enough to fell an elephant. These drugs might have saved his life, but they also had a debilitating side effect. Hopper was so doped up in detox that his body virtually froze. He later described how for nearly 3 months he was in a state that mimicked Parkinson's disease. He could barely move or speak. His hands shook violently. His muscles were rigid. The once vibrant, hyperactive actor was reduced to a statue with a heartbeat, trapped in a prison of chemical tranquility. During this period, they even assigned him simple chores like cleaning toilets in the facility, tasks he physically struggled to do. In one darkly comic anecdote, Dennis remembered scrubbing a floor, shaking so badly he couldn't hold the rag and crying out, "I can't do it!" only for a stern orderly to bark back, "Oh, you're going to do it!" It was humiliation on top of agony, but perhaps a fitting penance for his excesses. Slowly, as the weeks passed, Dennis Hopper emerged from this fog. The medications were adjusted, the withdrawal symptoms faded, and his motor functions returned. By late 1983, Dennis Hopper was something he hadn't been since his teen years, sober. The storm had passed, leaving him battered but alive, with mind and body intact, more or less. And with sobriety came clarity. He surveyed the wreckage of his life. 5 failed marriages, 2 estranged children, a career that had long been stuck in second gear, and the recent jungle debacle that had nearly been his epitaph. And he decided he wasn't going out like that. Dennis Hopper had always been a survivor, and now he had survived himself. It was time to rebuild. Indeed, the years that followed saw one of Hollywood's great comebacks. Hopper returned to acting with a vengeance, delivering iconic performances, ironically often playing deranged villains or addicts, but doing so clean and sober. In 1986, he reminded the world of his talent with an Oscar-nominated turn as a basketball drunk in Hoosiers and an unforgettable, terrifying role in Blue Velvet. This was the beginning of Hopper's second act, where the industry celebrated him not just as a rebel, but as a seasoned artist who tamed his demons. Yet even as he moved forward, Dennis never entirely left behind the legacy of his wilder days, nor did he seem ashamed of it. In fact, one episode in particular became a favourite yarn to spin in interviews, with a mischievous gleam in his eye. Dennis Hopper lived on for a few more decades after the Jungle Warriors fiasco, and he often spoke about that insane chapter with a mix of candour, remorse, and bemused humour. It became part of his legend, a cautionary tale he could laugh about since, miraculously, he'd come out the other side. It was around then I decided it was time to get into rehab. He quipped in one interview, understating the obvious. With a chuckle, he would describe how he never even made it to the set of Jungle Warriors, because the Mexican jungle had other plans for him. He didn't shy away from the most outrageous details either. In a Guardian interview years later, Hopper roared with laughter recalling the incident. "I thought the Third World War had started. I masturbated in front of a tree and thought I'd become a galaxy." By then he could joke that such a psychotic break was, in his warped view, him being in a good mood. It takes a truly singular individual to reflect on a night of cosmic-level insanity and effectively say, "Well, I was feeling pretty great about it." Hopper also acknowledged more seriously how lucky he was to have survived that ordeal, and how close it brought him to oblivion. He referred to the months of recovery from the antipsychotic drugs as a kind of purgatory, a lesson he'd never forget. "Quite honestly, I was in such bad shape that to survive and to come out with a mind and to have a second chance was really an amazing thing," he admitted in retrospect, showing a rare moment of humility. Dennis seemed genuinely grateful that he got to rebuild his life and career after flying so close to the sun. The Dennis Hopper who sat for interviews in the 1990s and 2000s was a mellower man. Still quirky and intense, sure, but also capable of self-deprecation and wisdom. He'd grin and tell tall tales of his lunatic youth, using them as both entertainment and a warning.
News out of Hollywood today. One of Hollywood's original bad boys, Dennis Hopper, has died at the age of 74. He had been battling prostate cancer.
Dennis Hopper passed away in 2010, leaving behind an incredible body of work and an equally incredible trove of anecdotes. The Jungle Warriors incident, though mortifying at the time, became an almost treasured part of his legacy. A symbol of how far into madness he went and how far back he had to climb. It encapsulates the duality of Hopper's life, the brilliant artist and the self-destructive addict, the comic absurdity and the tragic danger of living on the edge. In the end, Hopper spent the biggest paycheck of his career not on luxury cars or mansions, but on a one-night psychedelic safari that cost him a job and nearly his life. Expensive? Absolutely. But as Dennis might have cheekily said with a glint in his eye, it made for one hell of a story, and for a rebel like him, that was almost worth the price.